Welcome to our March Influential Women of the Sierra Nevada workshop, our third workshop of 2021. My name is Sarah De Levesque, and I am Director of Influential Women of the Sierra Nevada. We are so excited to have you here today. This is going to be a valuable experience, and we're so happy to share it with you. For those of you who are not, who are new to us, Influential Women of the Sierra Nevada, which is formerly Sierra Nevada Powerful Women, is in its fourth year of bringing the community together in celebration of the incredible women in the Northern Nevada community. In fact, I think we may even have a few of our past winners of the Influential Women of the Sierra Nevada Awards with us today. And so if you're a past winner, please say hello in the chat and tell us, maybe add what year you won. This is, again, we've done 3 years and we're going into our fourth coming up. In May, we will launch into this year's campaign to identify and honor the 2021 Influential Women of the Sierra Nevada. So please stay tuned for our announcements about that. And in the meantime, start thinking about all those incredible women you want to nominate this year. So in addition to being a platform to honor influential women in the community, in 2020, we launched this virtual workshop series in an effort to create more opportunities for professional development and connection within this inspiring community. And that is why we're gathered here today. Today's program touches on a critical topic that, in my opinion, is not addressed nearly enough in the workplace, but can be so impactful on how we operate and achieve success: diversity and inclusion. And the best part of today's program, and you guys will learn this very soon, is our presenters. You're going to just love them. It's a mother-daughter duo, and they are just so fun to watch together. But before I introduce them, I just want to run through a few of our technical points since we're in this virtual space. First of all, please be sure to ask questions anytime. The chat function is a great place to drop questions and comments, share resources and thoughts. And I know that our presenters will also ask you to engage at certain points in the program as well. And again, if you haven't introduced yourselves, please do so there. There are about 100 different ways you can watch our program via Zoom. So we always encourage, because there are slides, we encourage you to watch in speaker view. That way you can see the slides and the speakers. We will be spotlighting our speakers today. But you can do that by clicking the view button in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you click on that and you click speaker view, you can choose how you want to watch this. If you have any technical difficulties, feel free to chat us on that as well. And then just as forewarning, probably at this point, a lot of people have already used breakouts, but we will be doing some breakouts today. So those you'll be kind of, as I like to say, virtually thrown into automatically and then brought back to us in the main group automatically. And so we'll walk you through that when we get to that point. So back to the good stuff. Research has repeatedly shown us that gender, ethnic, and racial diversity have all been linked to overall company success. Unfortunately, many obstacles to building diverse and inclusive workplaces still exist, including a lack of understanding by organizations and individuals about the importance of it, the role they play in it, and how they can positively affect it. Today, I'm excited to introduce a mother-daughter duo who will be sharing their expertise, experience, and strategies around diversity and inclusion in the workplace, as well as specifically teaching us about microaggressions, the barriers they can create, and how we can address them. Tiffany Young is currently the Director of Equity and Diversity for Washoe County School District. Her work is within systems to support and clarify the role of equity, diversity, and cultural competency interwoven into all schools, departments, and systems. Leading work around programs, policies, and practices that must be addressed through an equitable and culturally responsive lens, as well as creating and facilitating professional learning around equity and cultural competency. Ms. Young owns Tiffany Young Consulting, LLC, working with organizations providing training and strategic planning. She is also an adjunct professor in human development and family studies department at the University of Nevada, Reno. She is a busy woman, you can hear. When I asked her what inspires her about this work, she told me, "I'm inspired by the opportunities to build the capacity of others. Young women of color like my daughter inspire me when I see that although obstacles may be in their lives, they still push through and are successful." KaPreace Young is a Reno native. Growing up in various parts of the Reno Sparks community, she has been exposed and experienced different aspects of the community. KaPreace is the mother of 6-year-old son, Zakai. She is currently the outreach coordinator for the Center for Student Engagement at the University of Nevada, Reno, where she is also a 2-time Black alumni, the co-creator of the Black Student Resource Guide, part of the Black Leadership Committee, and Black at the Pack Affinity Group. KaPreace is the co-founder of Shades of Queening, Black Women's Empowerment Group that focuses on uplifting, empowering, and supporting Black females from ages young to wise in the Northern Nevada community. She is an advocate and an activist for the progression of the Black community, not only in Reno, but in the entire country. When I asked her what inspires her about this work, she told me, my inspiration comes from the women before me, but also for the generations to come. The sacrifices that have been made by women in my life before me have opened doors to the opportunities I have encountered. However, my story is not mine to keep. It is mine to share with young ladies who look up to me. I am very excited to see these 2 women work together today to share with us. Please welcome Tiffany and KaPreace.
Good morning, everyone. It is so exciting to be here in this space with you. I'm excited to be here with my daughter, who is absolutely amazing, and looking forward to just doing the work around building capacity. I also have an amazing son, so I know this is influential women, but I have an amazing son who is 20. And so I'm excited to be able to share our story, give you some resources, build your capacity, and just engage in some authentic dialogue today. So thank you for having me. KaPreace.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you for being here, being willing to have these conversations and participate with us. And as my mother said, I'm excited to be here with her as well. And as you heard, I also have a son. So not only are we 2 women being mother and daughter duo, but we're also 2 women parenting 2 children that are boys. So thank you. I'm excited to get started today.
So as Sarah and Carrie did some work, they may have sent out the packet that you all are going to look at today. I'm excited to just kind of be here because I've been recovering from knee surgery. So I've gotten dressed and combed my hair today. So I'm excited about that. But we are very, very interested in the work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I put the packet in your chat, and I'm going to also share my screen at this time so that you all can see as we work through this conversation. One of the things I want to, my apologies, one of the things I would like to encourage you all to do is feel free to change your name. So in your name, you can put in your pronouns if you like. If you like to put in your pronouns attached to your name, go ahead and do that, but you don't have to. As we start talking today about the microaggressions in the workplace, I just want to give you a little background as to how we got here. Very rarely do we as professional women have the opportunity to be in a space like this with our children. And so I have been so blessed to watch my daughter grow up literally on my hip. Being at meetings and communities, going to neighborhood advisory boards, really pushing and advocating. But also now that I see her as this young professional, what we found is that we were starting to experience very similar things in our workspace. And so I saw myself moving from parenting to mentoring to guiding. But then I also saw myself learning and growing. And so hearing from her and seeing what she was doing, we submitted a proposal last year to the statewide diversity summit. And at that time, the title was called Black at Work, Microaggressions in the Workplace. And so fast forward, we've been able to share this conversation in a couple of spaces. And what you'll see today is not only are we mother-daughter, we have mirrored lived experiences. We also have mirrored levels of experience, but we also have mirrored levels of pain and trauma that we've had to endure. So we are here today not to point a finger or to make anyone feel bad, but to talk about the existence of what is. And so our hope is that when you walk away, you have a new perspective, that we've been able to build and refocus your lens around some of these topics, and that you're willing to authentically lean in. So we thank you again for just being with us here today. So you already kind of heard our titles and our background, and this picture of the 2 of us really excites me because this is a generational exploration. Some communities talk about generational wealth. Other communities talk about generational pain and trauma. Other communities talk about generational progress. And so when I look at my daughter, I think, wow, oh, to be 24 with a master's degree and running a program at the university, but it is just exciting for me. So as a Black professional woman, to see my Black professional daughter thriving fills me with such joy. KaPreace is doing amazing things, and oftentimes people say, you're just like your mom. And I remember times when she would say, I'm tired of being Tiffany Young's daughter. And now she's like, do you know who my mom is? So I am vice versa saying, do you know who my daughter is? Because if we don't uplift each other, not only as women, but as mothers and daughters, then we may miss the fact that others may not. KaPreace, do you want to share some thoughts around just our introduction?
Yeah, I think it's very important too, as my mom has said, that we have these generational experiences and these mirrored experiences. But it's so great, and the one thing I'll say that I really do appreciate about our relationship, both personally and professionally, is even though we may have the same goals or the same outlooks or the same engagement levels, we are two very different people. And so one thing I appreciate my mom saying is not only is she leading and mentoring and guiding me, but she's also learning as well. And so I think that is something that is very important to keep in mind, is that it's a two-way street. Yes, she is my mother, but she's also learning from me too. We're both been the president of the Northern Nevada Black Cultural Awareness Society, but I know that people will look at it and say, wow, Tiffany, you led, and now KaPreace is leading, and it's different, but it's the same. And people always say, it's like I'm looking at a spitting image. So it's great to be able to explain our story, but also to provide with some insight for growth for you all as well.
Yeah. And the thing is, I want to share is when you look at this introduction and we start talking about navigating in white spaces, what I am always intentional about, anyone who has talked to me or been in any work that I've done, is that we've got to name what's happening. We don't do that in a way to harm, but we have to name it. And so we as Black professional women are going to have very different experiences than our white colleagues. That doesn't make it wrong. It means that it's different. And if we can't courageously lean into these conversations, the likelihood that things will change will be very, very low. And so when we talk about these microaggressions, these are our lived experiences. And if there are things that you cannot connect to and relate to, what we're asking you to do is lean in and listen. If it makes you uncomfortable, lean in even more. If you're unsure about how to respond, ask a question. If you're not really understanding what that looks like for us, engage. And so this is your time to grow and your time to build. So we want to share with you a little timeline of what we've kind of had to experience. Go ahead, KaPreace.
So in 2014, it was this big transition for our family. I actually was going into my senior year of high school, and I found out that I was pregnant. And so to be 16 and pregnant at that time, one, this is not something that was planned, so I already knew like this is something that was going to change my life and my family's life forever, right? And I was also playing volleyball. I had high hopes of going to a historically Black college at Dillard University, which is in Louisiana, and playing volleyball for them. And so it changed a lot of my outlook. It changed the path that my mom had guided me through, and it changed our relationship. But at the same time, having my son, it also brought us closer, because now she was not just parenting her daughter, but she was parenting her daughter who is a mother, who is graduating from high school, who still is going to go to college, and who is still going to be successful. And so it changed the dynamics, but it also allowed us to take on a new perspective. As I mentioned, I graduated high school. I went to TMCC High School, which is a dual college program. And I actually was about like 3 credits short of an associate's degree. And while I was so close, I was like, I've came so far, right? And I had so much support. I had so much help. I had so many people there loving and supporting me. And I had my mom right there who was always by my side helping and assisting. And also in that time, we talk about these mirrored experiences. Not only did I graduate from high school, but then my mom also graduated with her master's degree as well. So we both made a next step in our education. And for her, I can say my appreciation came from everything that I saw her go through while I was growing up and all of the accomplishments that she made. But I appreciated it so much because not only did she have myself there, she had her son there, my brother, but she also had my son there. So she had these generations and her mother. So she had these generations to see the accomplishments that we both had gone through.
Yes, and so KaPreace graduated from high school, and a lot of the stigma around teen pregnancy, around Black teens being pregnant, there were so many low expectations about her, and at no time did I lower that expectation. I mean, we had conversations where it was like, you're going to strap that baby to your back and you're going to take the baby to class with you, but you were going to do this. There was not an option. And so we moved forward to 2016, and that's really this tipping point that happened. KaPreace has an amazing success story. She had a baby her senior year of high school. She finished her bachelor's degree in 2.5 years, and then she went on to finish her master's degree. Again, she's 24 years old. She also did this with all scholarships and grants. She had no college debt. And so I was pushing, apply for this and apply for that. You have to have a career and a life because you have to care for this baby. And so in 2016, she graduated with her bachelor's degree, and she began her career in higher ed. And she then started to experience what we will term and talk about around these microaggressions. She began calling me and talking about things that were happening in the workplace, how people were treating her, statements that were being made to her or about her, whether it be about her age or her race. She also started talking about and realizing that some of the things I had shared with her that I was experiencing, she was experiencing. Because when you tell someone about something that's happening to you, you have one or two responses. Oh, I understand that and that makes sense. Or people say, is that really the case, or is it that serious? And so in 2016, she started recognizing that these microaggressions were occurring for her professionally. So we began talking about things about how do you respond to this? Here is a certain situation, even to the point where she was second guessing what was happening. Like, is this real? Like, do you think this happened because I'm Black? Do you think this happened because I'm young? Do you think this happened because I'm a woman? And so even second guessing her own identity in her workspace became a bit of a challenge. So we started talking through these things as they started showing up for her in 2016. And then fast forward into 2020, KaPreace.
In 2020, as you all may have heard my mom say earlier, I used to go through these moments where everybody would say, oh, you're Tiffany Young's daughter. Oh, you're just like your mom. And I tried to, find my own identity. But when you're always involved or you're always around these environments, they start to become your passions. They start to become things that you want to get involved in, that you want to get invested in. And so that's where we start seeing a lot more mirrored experiences on a positive note, because while my mother is the director of diversity and equity, I started taking a more direct involvement in these things as well. So I wanted to learn more about equity and diversity while she is in a K through 12 realm and I'm deciding to go through the higher ed track, right? But we're still learning to manage and go through these lived experiences and the professional generational microaggressions. So it's important to understand that even as time progresses, these microaggressions are still present and they may take a different form. They may sound different or they may look different, but the feeling that somebody experiences when they hear it or when that microaggression is placed onto them is going to still have the same effect. So while we're starting to grow in our professions, while I'm starting to further my education and my career in higher ed, we also have these aha moments, right? And it's like, I am now dealing with things that I've heard my mother talk about, but because of the relationship that we've had, because of the conversations that we've had, a light bulb clicks. So as this time from 2016 to 2020 happens, I'm going from questioning my own identity to standing firm in my identity because I've now been educated on a personal and professional level.
Yes.
Mommy, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I would just like to think about the fact that what we do as women oftentimes comes from, for some of us, this passion to support and build up women. But if the women around us look like us all, sound like us all, and have lived experiences, and then women that come into our space that are different from us, do we open that door? Do we welcome them? Do we build them up? And when I think about young women in particular, one of my largest pet peeves, I've told KaPreace probably since she was 6, is you need to have the ability to make a decision. And when you talk to young women, they struggle in that. Something simple as buying clothes to applying for a job to what door to walk into. Young women struggle with making a decision, and they question their identity and they question their capability and they question whether or not they can stand firm in that. So I was adamant because I knew the obstacles that my young Black female daughter was going to face, being a pregnant teen, being a young graduate, starting to build her career, and knowing what I had experienced. So if nothing else, it was to stand firm in your word and your commitment, stand strong, honor and love your voice, and know that you have value in any room or space that you walk into. And that has been key for a push for me. So when I think about that, we know that COVID-19 was a disastrous year for everyone who had a pulse. So we're not going to say anyone in particular had any better year than anyone else. But for us, like other homes, we all ended up all together in the house. So we had 5 generations in our home. And the youngest at the time was 5 actually, and the oldest was 79. So we had myself, my son and my daughter, my grandson, and then my mother, who is now 80, all in this house together. So we had people that were doing distance learning, my grandson. We had my daughter who was finishing her master's degree. We had my son who was taking his courses at UNR. We had myself who was working from home, my daughter working from home, my mother who had worked at the Boys and Girls Club. There was chaos, tension, and stress in the house. And what we found out was that this time that you need for healing was a challenge. And so KaPreace shared with me this piece that she wrote, and I found it to be so moving. She shared it a couple of times, but I found it to be so impactful.
As my mother mentioned, we've all been dealing with COVID, but during this time of COVID, for myself as a Black woman, I was very lost, I had 29 people on my father's side of the family catch COVID at the same time as we were laying my great grandmother to rest, whose birthday I was also born on. So it was like my family is being hit from every angle, but I'm also thankful that nobody that in the house that I was living in had caught it. At the same time, we're in a time of social unrest. And I felt like we have these stay-at-home orders, and yet Black women and Black men are still being killed at an all-time high. And so I was like, I can't go outside because of COVID. I can't go outside because if I run around my block at that time, we were all working out. We were doing things together. I was getting my son outside. We were trying to get my grandmother outside. And I was like, I can't run around my block because that could have been me. That could have been my son. That could have been my brother. And so I'm just like, how do I deal with all of these things that are happening? So I wrote this piece that I'm going to share with you all called Bereavement Time. It says, to whom it may concern, I do not have enough bereavement time off. Every time a Black person is murdered, I experience mourning, loss, and a heightened anxiety. There is no bereavement category for someone who could have been me, a Black person I know or am related to. There is not enough sick time allocated for me to recover from the sicknesses I feel from seeing an image, listening to the screams begging for a life, or hearing another guilty murderer didn't get convicted, let alone arrested. Paid time off does not suffice for the decades of racism, dehumanizing, emasculating, traumatizing, and degrading injustices done to my people. So if I seem distracted during a meeting, inattentive during a conversation, or a little on edge, you know why. Please note this is nothing new, but a reoccurring feeling for me as a Black woman. It's more than anger that is being experienced. It is sorrow, sickness to my stomach, irritation, anxiety, hate, fury, rage, hopelessness, motivation to make change, hopelessness, terror, confusion. The list goes on. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it could have been me, my mother, my sister, my son, my father, my brother, my cousin, my uncle, my pastor, my nephew, my best friend. Sincerely, from a Black mother of a Black son, a Black daughter of a Black woman and man, and a Black sister to a Black brother.
So as you all look at this bereavement time piece and think about what KaPreace has said, we want to take some time to just activate the chat. We want to take some time to activate your engagement. And we're going to do a hashtag takeaway from that. So if you all could, in your chat, give us the hashtag pound sign and your one word takeaway from what you heard in this bereavement time piece from KaPreace. So you could say hashtag powerful, hashtag I'm excited, hashtag confused, whatever you choose. What is your one word takeaway? Please go ahead and use the chat feature to just engage at this moment. Right here, power of story. Thank you, Tracy. Internal strength, tears, conviction, moving forward, satin.
Yes, thank you.
Whirlwind.
As you all continue to put your comments in the chat, just providing some insight. This is something that I think about all the time, because really it's like when there is another death of a Black man or Black woman or Black person, it's kind of like I can't focus, at work. And the thing that we'll continue to talk about is that us, myself and my mother, as Black women, we go to work and we put a hat on. But when we leave work, we don't take off the hat of the color of our skin or our cultural identity. And so that's something that we carry with us everywhere. So while when we're at work, maybe it's 8 to 5, or maybe you have a different schedule, that's your focus. And so for us, we have a multifaceted focus. And for us, our identity is not a monolith. There are so many different aspects and levels to the identities that we hold.
Mm-hmm. And what we know is that because of our ties to the community, there's not the off switch. There's not the option to check out. There's not the option to lay this piece down and focus on another piece. There is the reality that this is a weight that sits heavy on our chest each day. So while we have a role and responsibility to show up at our jobs, we also have a role and responsibility to commit to our communities. And we are oftentimes in the midst of a storm. Our jobs have expectations of us, and our communities have expectations of us. And neither side see what we're dealing with. We're fighting and advocating on both sides. And oftentimes we're seen as, for lack of a better word, the black sheep on both sides. And that's what it feels like to us. Now, whether anyone's designated that statement, that is what we feel as we walk through these spaces each day. So we're encouraging to have this conversation, to hear these lived experiences. And we ask you, we're going to ask you some questions. So when we think about diversifying our workforce, this is where I get into kind of my hat in my world of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I stay locked into these conversations because I believe that we as a system and a society have done a very poor job of the word diversity and diversify. We have not truly defined the word diversity. So I hear businesses and organizations and companies, and they say things like, we want to diversify our workforce. So I've gotten to a place where I want to know, what does that mean? Because when we talk about diversity, everyone lands on the shade of brown. And what I tell people all the time, it's not a bonus that you get because you're a shade of brown for diversity. But because we've done a poor job, we have not fully identified what we mean. Let's name it. Let's identify the categories. Are we talking about racial diversity or gender diversity or socioeconomic diversity or sexual orientation or varying levels of gifts and abilities and talents? We need to really be intentional about that. And so when we ask why diversify our workforce, it's even more about, are we ready to diversify our workforce? Are we looking at whether or not we have a funneled approach to our businesses? At the very bottom layer, at the ground floor, are our communities of color and our communities that speak a different language and our communities with varying levels of ability. And as we funnel to the top, we lose some of that. When people come in, are we promoting and are we monitoring? Are we coaching and building? As we look at our businesses and organizations, are we hearing voices that are not like ours, and where do we place the value? So when we start talking about why diversity in the workforce, we're going to take a look at the first page of the packet that you all have. So if you've printed it or if you can pull it up on your screen, we're going to talk about a couple of things, because consider your level of commitment to diversity and inclusion. And is it lip service or is it intentional? Are we putting it into practice? Are you taking action as a board or as a group or an organization? If so, what does that look like? How are you examining your commitment? Sorry about the typo, what is your why? Why are you trying to diversify your workforce? Is it because it's a knee-jerk reaction? Is it because of all the things that happened in the public with George Floyd? Is it because you genuinely believe that bringing in diverse voices, experiences, and skills will enhance your business? What is your why? Does reputation matter? There are a lot of businesses that are catching a lot of flack because of the lack of diversity or the push for diversity. So you need to ask yourself, does your reputation matter? And understand this, perception is real. So many people have made statements, well, it's in our mission, it's in our vision, it's in our strategic plan. But if people are looking at your organization, if they're looking at your business, they're looking at your circles and your groups, perception is still going to be very real. So on page 1 of your packet, there's like 5 questions that you can start to look at. This comes from a lot of work around board diversity training, and really thinking about, is your organization's reputation negatively or positively being impacted by your board's leadership, current composition in relation to diversity? If someone were to make assumptions about your organizational values based on your board or leadership composition, what would they be likely to think? How well are we cultivating a deeper understanding of community or communities that we serve and bringing their perspective, needs, feedback, and priorities into our strategic boardroom discussions? Are we ever at risk of making decisions without fully understanding how these decisions affect those we serve? And then if we were to make a deeper commitment to diversity, and this is, I think, the most powerful of all the questions, inclusion, cultural competency, and equity, what would that mean for your mission, your work, and the people, clients, students, whoever it is that you serve? What would that look like? And now we want to talk to you about the root of this discussion today is these microaggressions that we experience in the workplace. So on your screen, you see this photo and it says, on my mind. And this is one of the keys you have to understand. What you individually experience is your true experience. You cannot determine that if KaPreace says this is what happens to her, it is not my job to say that's not real. It is not my job to say it is not that bad. It is my job to hear her. So when we talk about microaggressions, for a definition, it is these brief, everyday, verbal, behavioral, environmental exchanges, both unintentional and intentional, that they send this disparaging kind of message to individual based on their group. Now, there are microaggressions that happen around race, around ethnicity, around gender, around socioeconomic status. And we're speaking today specifically around the microaggressions we've experienced as Black women. What you have to understand is that microaggressions can have a serious impact and should not be dismissed because they are brief, they're often unintentional in nature. So understand that. No one wakes up and says, let me see how many microaggressions I can throw out. How many times can I offend or harm someone? No one intentionally does that. But we have to remember that the microaggressions that people experience, they're linked to things around depression, anxiety-related systems, diminished psychological well-being and physical health. And what I like to consider is the mosquito bite. All of us has probably been bitten by a mosquito. The first time you got the bite probably wasn't that bad. So when someone said, tell me about the Black experience, might not have been that first time. But the second mosquito bite, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth mosquito bite, there's your microaggression. Because now that you've been bitten so many times, it's now caused a bit of anxiety. It's caused some diminished psychological well-being. You've kind of had it to the point, right? The can I touch your hair? The, what is it like to be a Black woman? Well, what is the Black community say? Things like that. And while the first time it happened, not so bad. You may be the 799th person that's asked that question, and there you have 799 mosquito bites. So those microaggressions, which we're going to get deeper in, we're going to talk more about those. KaPreace.
Yeah, I think some of the challenges that we face, again, those are things that are reoccurring. As I mentioned, this hat that we wear, the identity, the color of our skin, this is not something that we can take off. And so even though myself and my mother, we may be so set and firm in our identities as Black women, that doesn't mean that we aren't still affected by these microaggressions. But I think it's also important is that you should call these things out when you see them or when you hear them. And when you aren't necessarily in the role of the person who is receiving the microaggression, these are some things that you may not see or may not understand, but just understand, as my mom said, the perception is real. So some things that we have heard or that we've experienced, again, these are these mirrored experiences, these are these mirrored paths that we've been on, is that you are so articulate, right? Code switching is something that may not be familiar to all, but for some of us, when we step into these professional settings, or depending on who else has a seat at the table, we have to change up the way in which we speak in order to be perceived as intelligent, to be perceived as deserving this seat at the table, or actually having those acknowledge and understand the things that we are saying. Did your hair grow? Like literally, I just got my hair done yesterday, and I can already imagine how many questions there are going to be. And so it kind of gets to the point where, am I limited to the face value that you receive or that you see of me? Am I just a Black face? Am I just a new hairstyle, right? And so it's these things that make you question your worth. And I'll say it's things that have made me, I'll make it personal, made me question my worth, because then I question, as my mom mentioned, I was like, am I a diversity hire? Was I only hired because my department needed to have some more people of color in their department, or people of a younger age in their department? And so it makes me second guess my own stance in my identity, in my department, in the world. And so these microaggressions, they aren't just something that affects somebody on one level. It's something that can be internalized, and it's something that can affect the outcomes and the way in which they interact with others.
And then when you think about the phrase, I can't imagine, I don't know how many times I've heard this statement. I can't imagine what you must be feeling. I can't imagine what you're going through. I can't imagine. And that's heavy, right? Because there's some power and privilege in making that statement, because I can't imagine. I can live it. I can feel it. And it's always, more so lately around race and culture. I just can't imagine. But there's nothing that follows behind that. Or the things around, you must be so strong. I've had statements made to me about, wow, I've had people even ask me, do you cry? And I'm thinking, I'm not a robot, and so they attribute that to some inner built strength, that because I have not shed a tear, that I'm stronger than others, but I have compartmentalized my functionality. There's no need for me to cry at work. And then if I do cry, does that show me as the weaker vessel, or does that show me as power? And so when we say things like, you must be so strong, it is just because I have been wired and designed to stand up and stay in place and function. I don't get the option to check out. So it's not a matter of being robotic. It is a matter of functionality. intentionality and survival. This be professional really hit home for both KaPreace and I. And it hit home for so many ways. Is that, what does that actually mean? What is the definition of professional? For myself, I am not a person that's used profanity. I don't use profanity at work. I don't use profanity in the community. I use profanity at home. Not saying that I didn't ever. I don't anymore. But I don't use profanity. And so sometimes when I hear people use profanity in workspaces, I wonder what would happen if I cursed in a meeting one day. I think people would lose their minds, right? I don't raise my voice. I don't stand up and bang on tables and things. But I know that as a Black woman, a shift in my posture in my seat can disturb someone. If I fold my arms, I'm seen a certain way. If my voice carries a little further across the room, if I lean in, it's perceived a certain way. And so this definition and conversation around professional has shown up, where people say things like, well, are you being professional? And I'm not sure what that means. Is there an assumption that I'm supposed to assimilate or be in a certain space? And for KaPreace, in this mentoring kind of space, while right now she's like, call me mom or call me mommy, and that's okay in this setting, but I even have to mentor her and guide her because we're often in the same space. Refer to me as Miss Young. I refer to you as Miss Young because I don't want people to take away what she's earned and what she's become in a professional space when she refers to me as mommy, and take her age to lessen whether or not she should be there. And so these are things that we have to always be cognizant of, what we have on, what we're going to say, the posture that we hold, and that we're often feeling like we're specimens in spaces. Look at your lips, look at your hair, look at your, and we don't hear these comments made towards other people.
And I'd also, I'd like to add around this idea of being professional. That right there, it makes me question, and we've had conversations about who gets to determine what professional is. And usually that means it's coming from the majority, which means it's not somebody who looks like me being Black. Sometimes it's not somebody who looks like me being a woman. And so when we think about these microaggressions, when you consider things, if somebody is telling you that maybe this is how something you've said has made me feel, also I would encourage you to consider where the microaggression originates, right? There's not many times where people who don't look like me, or I don't hear a lot of people telling white women, oh my gosh, how did your hair grow overnight? And so that continues to make me think, that we have to work harder because of the way that I look, I stand out more, right? So this idea of being professional or any of these other microaggressions, they originated because of the differences that we may have. And in our group, something that we also talked about is that, yes, we may value everyone, but it's also very important to identify the differences within each other, whether it's your gender, whether it's your skin color, whether it's your background, your varied ability, etc. But it's important, and mommy, as you told me, is that if you don't see color, if you don't see race, you don't see me. So while we value the communities that we are in, it's important to identify the differences within each other so that we can move forward and hopefully move away from these microaggressions.
Yes. And so when we're in these spaces, we have to think about the fact that we make contradictory statements for survival and response. So we say things like, we want to increase the diversity in our workforce. And then we say, well, we don't see color. Well, I'm confused, right? And so what I tell people is that if you can find a crayon in a box of crayons, you can see color. And so it's not a matter of having a problem with seeing color. It's how you respond. Do you have a certain expectation that I'm going to speak a certain way or walk a certain way or carry myself a certain way based on my skin color? That is the work that we have to do. So we're going to look really quick at pages 2 and 3 in your packets, because this is where this root that KaPreace talked about, these microaggressions come from somewhere, and they come from our biases. So earlier, I talked about, like, if you have a pulse, right, you have a culture, but guess what? If you have a pulse, you have a bias. So when we get into these conversations around diversity and the word implicit bias or unconscious bias comes up, and we have the clutching of our proverbial pearls, like, oh no, not me, I don't have any biases. Well, if you have a pulse, you have a bias. And so we have to own that. We also have to remember biases are easy to wrap our heads around when we say things like, I like cake versus cookies. Those are easy things to kind of step into. When we start talking about race and ethnicity and gender and sexual orientation and socioeconomic status, then we want to be seen as good. The conversation around bias is not a good, bad conversation. It is the existence that they are there. If we can get to that first step, consider it a house. So the porch is the awakening and awareness that you have biases. When you get to the front door, is being willing to address them. In order for you to get into that house, you are going to have to own them. So we have to think about it from that structure. So pages 2 and 3 just kind of give you a brief outline around implicit biases. But at the bottom of page 2, it talks about these key characteristics. And the key characteristics are what you want to hold on to. Implicit biases, they're pervasive. They run through our heads all the time. We walk into a room, predominantly white, we see a person of color, our mind automatically, our face goes to that person, and then we wonder, especially if we don't know them, why are they there? And then why does that come up for us? We see two moms in a home and we wonder, is that the way a family should be defined? We see a woman walk in, jeans and a t-shirt, right? We wonder, is she professional? If someone speaks a certain language or they have a bit of a twang or a Southern draw, we have a certain respond to it. And so our biases are there all the time. Someone walks into a room, we sum them up in a matter of seconds. And we may say that we don't, but we do. We look at their skin tone, we look at their skin color, we look at their height, we look at their shape, we look at their weight, we listen to their voice, we look at the way they're dressed. All of these things are happening unconsciously, and for some of us, consciously. Implicit biases, they're explicit, they're connected. So we may be sitting on this call right now in this workshop going, this is an amazing workshop. We may say it with our face, with our voice, but our faces are doing this, our postures are doing this. So we're going, this is a great workshop. Tiffany and KaPreace are doing amazing, but our body language is doing the absolute opposite. And we may unconsciously be doing that. So understand that our minds still have some role in that. On page 3, the other bias that talks about is, we hold these kind of associations outside of our own conscious awareness. No one wakes up in the morning and says, let me see how many people I can be a barrier to, how many people can I exclude in my environment. No one wakes up to do that, but we unconsciously do it all the time. When we speak over someone, if someone makes a statement and we take it upon ourselves to clarify what they meant without asking for that, when we not acknowledge the fact that we take up the space that we're in and we don't give voice to others around us, when we think about that, what we see as power, we have to be careful. Some of us call ourselves advocates for women, but we often become silences of women, because we talk so much that we don't allow the women that we're advocating for to be present and hold space. So we have to step back and think about that. We generally hold implicit biases towards our own in-groups, right? So just take a mental inventory for a second. Think about your closest 5 friends. Think about the most outings that you've gone to when the world was open with people around you. Think about the top books and materials, the top music that you listen to. Think about the top shows that you watch, right? Take some inventory, because we favor our own in-group. And that's just because that's the way we were built. The other part is implicit biases. They have real world effects. That is what forms these microaggressions. So if we believe a certain thing about a race of people or a gender or a group, we make statements that become microaggressions that land on people. But implicit biases are malleable. We can do the work. We can meet and talk to other people. We can engage, but we want to be careful. We don't want to have these social voyeuristic experiences where it's like, Tiffany, let's have coffee. Tell me about the Black experience today, and then you never talk to me again. We want it to be authentic. We want it to be genuine so that you can mold and shift and change. So the implicit bias conversation is connected to the microaggression piece. They're not separate. They don't live independently, and we have to be aware of that. KaPreace, do you want to share anything else on that piece before we move on to the types of microaggressions?
I would just like to make the connection that, again, as we're talking about all of these ideas, these microaggressions, these implicit biases, and then ultimately leading up to this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, again, remember that just because you check your implicit biases or you have identified that, oh, I may have heard or I may have said a microaggression, that's not the end of this work. And so you can change your implicit biases, but there are always going to be things that come up. And so working to identify those things, like I mentioned in our breakout group, on a personal level. So then you're doing the internal work, and then you are now benefiting the company that you're working for, which in turn is going to benefit the communities and the people that you serve.
Okay, thank you. So there are several microaggressions, but for today's purpose, we're going to talk about the 3 types of microaggressions. We hear this word all the time, and remember we talked about it being that mosquito bite. So that statement that you've made over and over again, that treatment. But they show up in 3 forms for the purpose of this discussion. There's a micro assault, there's a micro insult, and then there's a micro invalidation. So when we think about these pieces, they sound really, really harsh. But the reality is, when they land on the individuals that have experienced them, they're real. Now, let me be clear, not every person feels the same way. So where I may feel the microaggression, someone who looks like me may not. And we have to be mindful of that. But that micro assault, that's kind of that overt discrimination. It's intentional, right? So you're deliberate posting things like Confederate flags or racial slurs or racial epithets, like you're not Black or you act so Black, right? We hear this happening. We've seen young people that have heard this where they're struggling with their identity, like you act so white or you act so this. And so what is Black for us for this purpose? Like, what is acting Black and what does that mean in this space? So you've had some kind of prime belief about how Black people or Black women should operate. Is there an expectation that I'm going to raise my voice and I'm going to shout and I'm going to get upset and angry? Or because I don't raise my voice, shout, and get angry, you think that I'm less Black? So think about that as that micro assault. The next is this micro insult. These are comments that communicate that the demographic that a person is a slight exception, like you made it out. You're the good one, right? We say statements like you're pretty for a Black girl, or you're treated like, you're the one that it's so great that, you're so articulate and you did so well. And a perfect example for this that have shown up for me is I am not a person that gives a lot of who I am personally into what I do at work. And I do that because that's a protective factor for me. I don't want a lot of people entering into my private space. But at times when I've shared things like, I'm originally from South Central Los Angeles. I grew up in a high gang neighborhood. I grew up in a Crip neighborhood. I grew up in a lot of drugs and gang violence. I've experienced a lot of things over my life. And so when I do share that aspect of me, when I've already talked or engaged, there's this shock and awe, like South Central. It's like there's some expectation that I should have this edgier piece to me. And I like to remind people that be glad you're getting this piece and not that other piece, right? But people have an assumption that because of how I was raised and how I was brought up, that I would have another way of engagement. And so that's when I get the statements like, but you speak so well, and well, you're so articulate, and you're so, and why wouldn't I be? Because there are great gifts, talents, and extremely amazing people that have come out of South Central. The last is this micro invalidation. And this is when we get these comments or this action that dismisses the historically disadvantaged group members. When we say things like that was in the past, like what you're feeling, it's not really that serious. Saying that we want to see more people like you, people laugh or they go against this color blindness. And so they say, Tiffany, I know you keep speaking about being a Black woman, but why does race have to be a factor? Because guess what? I'm going to be Black 365 days of the year, and I don't get to take it off on March 1st. So for me, my lived experience, my perception, everything that I do includes the fact that I'm a Black woman. It's not an option. I don't wake up tomorrow and go, I'm not going to be Black tomorrow. KaPreace, don't be Black on Friday. It doesn't work that way. We are going to have this threaded through our existence, and that's a reality that we have. This is, again, While it says navigating predominantly white spaces, this is the reality of where KaPreace and I are coming to you with this discussion. We are in predominantly white spaces. I grew up in South Central, so I was in a predominantly, I would say all Black, they say predominantly, but it was all Black in LA where I lived. I had not ever had a white teacher, a white administrator until I came to Nevada. My daughter had the polar opposite experience where she was born and raised here. She's a product of half South Central, half Compton, her and my son, but living here and working here is very different. And I've not really been in a space where I've been in the predominant number of people of color that look like me. So it is about navigating these spaces for us professionally. The other thing I would say to this is that in this navigation, we have to have some collective efficacy, like within our Black community, but also what's happening in our white community. Oftentimes I'll hear white colleagues say, you know, I went somewhere and I did this and I was a minority when I went there. And what I correct them and say is you had a minority moment because you had a choice. You had a choice to lean into that. You had a minority moment, right? And the minority designation leaves because you have choice, power, and position. For many of us, we don't get to step out of the minority category. So we've got to really start thinking about that. So I'm gonna let KaPreace talk to you a little bit about some of our bullet points on navigating predominantly white spaces before we move on.
Thank you. And, to your point about the choice, I think it's important to understand and to keep in mind that there's not an option for us not to be impacted, right? Because this is not something that we can take off, and also because of the many hats that we wear too. So for myself and my mom, we are very much not just invested in the jobs that we have, but also in the community. And so when there are things going on in society that's affecting the Black community, our phones are not ringing. So we have to take the time to heal for ourselves, but then also because of the leadership roles that we've held in our community, we have so many hats. We don't necessarily always get the chance to digest how we're feeling because the news is calling us or somebody from the city council is calling us. And while it's great that we are being called, also remember that this is a reactionary call. It's not something that happened at the beginning. So that's where, trust comes into play. We consider, am I being tokenized? Are these things that you're doing, or do I have a seat at the table now because of an incident? Or have you always allowed me a seat at the table? Also, the idea of safety, not just physical safety, but also in your job security, in the length of time that you've been there, and the movement of excelling in your career. Are you going to be stagnant, or is there going to be room for you to progress? But also considering your identity. Something that we've continued to say is that sometimes there is an internalization that we have about the identity that we hold, whether it's as a woman, as a parent, and then also adding the word Black in front of those things, right? And so being secure in the identities that we have. And so we have to check that or consider that at the door. Before I walk into work, I have to say, what does my face look like? What does my body posture say? Considering the clothes that I wear, I would say that my mom has always encouraged me, of course, to look presentable, right? But sometimes I am like, I'm going to push the boundaries a little bit. I'm going to wear a shirt that says Black lives still matter, or Black lives have always mattered, right? But that's part of my identity. And that means that I am secure. But in these white spaces, I have to say, is this going to be accepted? Is this going to be appropriate or deemed appropriate by my supervisor or my boss? And how am I going to respond if something comes up? But that also leads into this voice. My mom has always told me that my voice holds weight, my voice holds power. And so when I'm in a room, I'm not in a room to take up space. And so as Black women, it's important that we recognize if we are being tokenized, but if we do have that seat at the table, it's your turn to use your voice to speak up. And so and also I think with that though, it comes a lot of responsibility. And I think that for myself, for my mom, maybe for other Black women, or Black people, we come to the table and we say, I am not the voice of the Black community, but I'm speaking on my personal and my lived experiences. And that goes back to safety, because now you're not being held responsible for what your organization, what your department, what your industry is doing to impact the Black community, but now you're speaking on behalf of yourself. This idea of the sense of self and authentic self, for some people it looks very different. Somebody may have mentioned about, oh, you talk so well, or you sound white, and it's like, but I don't know what that means, because that's my authentic self. So navigating these white spaces, it means that we have to be prepared to walk into the room and be exactly who we are. And that could mean anything for us. That can mean how my hair looks, my mom saying that she doesn't necessarily open up her personal. On the flip side of that, that's something that I do on a very often occasion, because I'm working with students, I'm advising students, I'm encouraging them to finish that degree. So whether I'm talking to Black females and telling them about my story of being a teen mom and the support that I have, or if I'm talking to students who are facing food insecurity and saying, I was working 3 part-time jobs during my undergrad, I was on food stamps, I was living in low-income housing. And so that's me being my authentic self. And that doesn't mean that when my mom comes to the table, she's not being her authentic self. That means that we have these ideas of who we are, and that's who we're allowing you to see. And then again, code switching. As I mentioned, when Dr. Bio said that adding that identity to her name, or adding that label to her name, code switching, sometimes it looks different in different areas, which is why we created Black at the Pack on campus, is because we needed a space to be our authentic selves, where we didn't feel so pressured to code switch. Sometimes I actually just was on a call or on a workshop, and there was a presenter, and she said she chooses not to code switch because she didn't feel like she was being her authentic self. But she also recognized that because of the title that she has, being a doctor, she has tenure at her institution, she gets to not code switch. And that's something that she says, I get to not do that. But for some people, they don't have the privilege they have to code switch in order to be accepted in their organization.
And I would just add to that, code switching conversation is interesting, because even the way I would talk to maybe my staff or talk to colleagues is going to be different. I've had people walk in when I'm talking to my staff and they have this, oh my gosh, and it's not like I'm yelling or anything, but it's a way that we relate. But this space of, when I think of code switching, it is ingrained in my memory of my mother saying, ain't a word, right? My mother has said that to me since I was little. Ain't a word. Ain't a word, right? AIN''T. And I do not say that word. And I don't say that word because my mother has always said it to me. But I know, and to Stephanie, she put in the actual term, she put in the emotional tax, the Black tax. I know what would happen if I drop my communication. If I relax into my communication, I am so careful about the way I present that sometimes I don't wear things like pants with pockets, because the minute I stick my hands in my pockets, if I'm training or presenting, it relaxes me. So I am always on with an intention to be at the top of my game. And so this code switching is that when I get home, I am so tired, because then I have to just let go of all of that. And that is weight, because I know the expectation of my language, my posture, my character, and where I have to be able to switch in and out of codes necessary for survival, right? For survival. The code sharing is one we talk about. When we talk about bringing people into these spaces, do we share the codes, right? So we like someone we hire, or someone that's working in close proximity with us, we'll tell them all the things, who to talk to, who to go to, who to avoid. If we don't like them, we do not share the codes. And for many of us that don't look like the predominant representation, we have to figure the codes out by ourselves. Some of it by trial and error, some of it by trial and fire, but we end up having to find out those codes. And so when you have people that come in, if we're truly talking about welcoming and inclusive and diverse environments, share the codes for success. When someone applies for a job and they don't get in, do we tell them why? Do we coach them up? Do we build them up? Do we open the doors with true, authentic welcoming? Seeking others like that, seeking others like us. Representation matters. For KaPreace, for 25 years now, it's come September, she has been looking at me. She has looked at me work with law enforcement, community and economic development. She has traveled. She's seen me work internationally. She has seen that in her direct view her entire life. But for many, walking into a space and seeing others like us, it's very scarce. There's not a lot of Black women that are in these spaces. And when I think about me in public education, I never wanted to go into education. I landed here because of a racial incident that involved my daughter. And so because I wanted things to change, I scrapped and scraped, but I was always involved. But seeking others like us, when I walk through a school and a little kid sees me, I've had little Black kids run up and hug me, and then classmates are like, do you know her? And I'm like, nope. Well, they're just happy to see me because I look like them. So seeing others like us is key. But that promotion to higher level positions that KaPreace talked about, sometimes we get pigeonholed into positions because you're really good at this. You really work really hard. You fight really well at this. And then we don't get the opportunity to promote because we don't necessarily fit those parameters. It becomes a challenge. But seeking like identity and higher level mentors, sometimes we have to reach out of our other spaces. I have colleagues that I work with all the way across the country that sometimes I have to just say, hey, this is where I'm at today. And they're like, I get that. Because some of my other colleagues, some of my white colleagues, if I say that, I either get a sense of pity and response, or is it really that bad? Yeah, it is. It is that bad. It is that heavy. Being taken over by white spaces. This I share with KaPreace, and we've had this same experience where we've made a statement in a meeting or made a statement in a conversation, and then someone's made the same exact statement. And where we got the eye roll, and then they got the, yeah, great point. Yeah. And so I'm thinking, we just made those statements. And so sometimes when we're in a room, while we stand out because of the color of our skin, we're still not seen or heard or respected. And so we have to understand what that looks like. Battling the white-splaining. And I say this because some people don't hear other people that are different from them. And so they want to hear someone like them talk to them. And they don't realize it because we haven't interrupted some of those things. And so when you're in a room and have a conversation, the next time someone of color is in that space and they make a statement, and then someone speaks immediately after them, that's your opportunity to watch and listen and think about, did you just hear the same two statements, but from two different voices? We're balancing social injustice and professional career. It's heavy, right? It is heavy. I've got a 20-year-old Black son who used to love to run, who lives over on the Kings Road area, who refuses to go out running because he doesn't want to be a Black kid in a mask and go running. And then I think about the fact that I work in equity and diversity, right? And then I'm trying to coach and build and engage in these conversations and getting people to understand. I spend time with law enforcement and university people, and I still carry the weight. And what also happens is, because I am so intentional about the work, people feel like they can say whatever they want to me, and they're like, because you can take it. And it doesn't mean because I don't snap, cry, or lash out, doesn't mean that it doesn't wound me. So people need to understand that I'm still human. But self-care, when it comes, when it does not turn off, I am constantly talking to KaPreace about being a 24, soon to be 25-year-old young woman, and you've got to care for yourself if you're going to stay in this fight. You've got to care for yourself. You've got to understand the weight and responsibility. You've got to check in and then check out when you need to. You've got to give yourself permission to check out. Yeah. And then KaPreace, do you want to cover that last point?
Yeah, and to your point about self-care, I think it's important because when you have a personal investment in something, but it also involves your professional investment, it's like, when do you make time, intentional time for yourself? Not saying, oh, I have an extra 30 minutes. No, blocking out time. And so it's very important, especially in the work that we both do, to make sure that we disconnect, we turn off, literally. We just have time for ourselves. But that also means that we then have to make space for ourselves, and that's including safe, welcoming, and inclusive environments, because we have an understanding that when we walk into the door, we know that there may not be as many people who look like us in those environments. So how do we make space for ourselves to feel welcome, to feel safe, and to feel like we're inclusive? And sometimes that means we are making space at the table. Other times that means that we are seeking others who look like us, who are like-minded like us, so that we can have that time to decompress about something that's happening, or even to talk about something positive that's happened for us. And so, with all of these things, it's important to understand and to note that it's a negotiation of our identity on a daily basis. We have to provide ourselves with self-affirmations, because of the self-doubt that we may hold, the internalizations that we may hold, but then also that self-management and that self-fulfillment. It's, as my mom has mentioned, she doesn't lash out or she doesn't cry, but I've recalled times where I've had to leave work and not even say why, especially after Breonna Taylor's murderers were not convicted. I had to leave work because I couldn't do it. And in that moment, I remember being asked, "Are you okay?" And I was like, if they see me cry, they're going to think that as soon as they say something to me, I'm going to crumble. Or if I lash out because I'm upset, they're going to think she's a ticking time bomb. Should she be in this area? But then also, when I have self-fulfillment, allowing myself or ourselves to be proud of the work that we are doing and doing it for ourselves, not seeking the validation from others, but saying, you did this because of the accomplishments that you have come to. You've done this because of the relationships that you built. You did not do this because you're a diversity hire. You deserve to be in these spaces.
Yeah. So with that said, we just want to continue to give you some more background around what kind of these themes and microaggressions look like. To KaPreace's point, it looks different for everyone, and there is just kind of this weight that we carry in businesses and organizations. Sometimes you may have one or two individuals that are representative of a minority, racial, or ethnic group, and we may not necessarily see them. So the microaggressions that often happen in some of these professional spaces, and again, some of them, they're unintentional. I don't believe that anyone is intentionally trying to harm anyone, but some of the things, the messaging, the things we want to be aware of is sometimes they send the message that you don't belong here. You're one of the good ones. Anger or harmful, you're dangerous because maybe if you did raise your voice or you did snap, you're here because you're Black. KaPreace has talked about that. Assuming that all Black women have the same experience. You have to remember that just because we have the same representative hue doesn't mean that we have the same experience. The tone policing based on racial stereotypes. So the things about, I wish we could talk, but when you talk, the way you talk to me makes me uncomfortable. So I've heard, things like that. And it's like, but I don't understand because I'm not yelling or screaming. I am firm in what I'm speaking of. And so because of my strength and my approach makes you uncomfortable, that's not about me. That's about you. And so we get this tone policing in these spaces, expressing surprise or judgment over appearance, this myth of meritocracy, the opportunity shaming that KaPreace kind of talked about, and then this uprooting the problem, making assumptions about seniority. And so, you get to a position, it's like, wow, how did you get to that position? Well, I worked hard. How did you get to your position? So you want to be able to acknowledge these things as well. So we're going to move to our next slide, and KaPreace is going to share, no breakout rooms, 7 things about Black trauma in predominantly white spaces.
So this is an article that I found actually shortly after some of the Black Lives Matter rise this summer. And so basically, these are some takeaways, to consider, especially with your organizations. So one is saying your names, acknowledging and saying the names, speaking on the things happening in our surrounding communities, in our society, instead of going into work and acting like everything is fine, because just because it's not affecting you, one, as citizens of our communities, it's important that we acknowledge what's happening, but also you don't know who else is being affected in the room. This idea of performative allyship. And so making sure that it's not just a reactionary response, or it's not for a short period of time, but you want to consider the history of your company's culture, the culture and the departmental makeup. And doing the math, making sure that people are there and representing varied identities, not just because you need to check a box, but because you value what it means for them to be a part of your organization. White check-ins, it's important that you acknowledge who you are in your identity, and making sure that you acknowledge the privilege that you have, that you may not have to. One of the questions said, how much of myself do I have to amputate? Acknowledging that you may not have to amputate as much as your minoritized counterparts. And so, you consider that a lot of organizations and departments have put out statements, but are you actually upholding what that statement means? Are you saying that you have a commitment to diversity, but yet it doesn't look like that when you look at the breakdown of who's in your department and the positions that they hold? And also understand that by not acknowledging the injustices, you're showing the power that you have to remove your personal identity when you come into the workplace. And so, but also thinking about laying your burden and separation anxiety from what it means to not be able to be your full authentic self. And then Black voices over white credit. We kind of talked about this, and saying that yes, you may give a Black person a seat at the table, or a person of color, whatever the case may be, a seat at the table, but are you allowing their voice to hold weight and to hold value? So what I would leave you with from these things is creating space for yourself, or making sure that you're creating space for people who don't look like you, people from different backgrounds. And consider if you're making your colleagues and employees tokens. And also consider that if by not having Black voices at the table, what are you saying about valuing your Black employees? Or even if it's people from other backgrounds, other minoritized populations with varied abilities and gendered identities. And then also consider if this is the first time that you're bringing these voices to the table. Is it because of a reactionary response, or is it because you truly have acknowledged that there are some disparities within your representation?
Thank you, KaPreace. And so this is an opportunity, as I said earlier, sometimes we get into these conversations and some of it may cause us a little discomfort. If you felt any piece of discomfort, ask yourself why. We tell people all the time that in that discomfort, that's where you can grow. And in order for us to address some of this, and connecting to Clara's question earlier, is like, what can we do? Well, we need to acknowledge these systems of power, privilege, and entitlement that feed the trauma, that feed the microaggressions. There are, in fact, barriers to successful outcomes in our business. Some of us just have this overwhelming unawareness of this need to adapt. We've always done things the way we've always done them. The people that we look at around the screen. One of the things I can tell you that this pandemic has done is that if you have paid true attention to who you've been looking at on Zoom and team meetings, and if everybody on the screen looks like you, there is a clear indication around some work that we need to do. And look at the different levels of position. This unawareness of this need to adapt, that's where those hidden implicit and unconscious biases show up, where we just keep doing things and no one stopped us. No one has corrected us. No one has interrupted the narrative. No one has spoken up, and they suffer in silence. So we keep perpetuating the outcomes that we have. These systems of power, privilege, and entitlement. Some of you may say, well, I don't have any privilege. Sometimes your presence and identity gives you privilege in a space that others do not. And so if we don't recognize these systems of power, privilege, and entitlement, this assumption that when we walk into a room, like, you're going to have to fight for the topic or the agenda, but your identity is not a marker that you need to hold, that is control. When you have control in a space that you don't have to opt out of what you say or what you do, that's where that system of power, that system of privilege, that system of entitlement shows up. And then the last is just this resistance to change that involve culture. When we think about the dynamics of where we are, businesses and organizations are panicking because they're going, oh no, we have to do something for diversity. And, I've been called about things, and KaPreace has been called, and can you come in and do a diversity talk? And then I say, well, then what? Right. And then they're like, excuse me. I'm like, well, do you want me to talk so that you can check a box? Are you truly going to internalize this? And so are you resistant to the change of the culture? We have such skill, will, gifts, and ability, so much talent in these communities, and it's not seen because it's not represented by the majority. And so if we're resistant to this change, then we're going to continue to allow these systems of power, privilege, and entitlement to show up. So my message always is that shift happens, S-H-I, F is in fabulous, T, but shift happens. If we allow you to be complacent, if we allow you to stay in the same place that you are in, you're going to continue to perpetuate the outcomes that you have. So we want to acknowledge that shift needs to happen. So KaPreace, talk to us about moving through anger and discussion.
Thank you. So, there are many things, I keep saying this word of internalization, but these are these questions, these underlying things that myself, my mother, other women have had to ask themselves, right? And so, like, do we leave the profession? Is this too much for us to handle? Do we think that we would be better off in a place? And that's not saying that we're being pushed out, but that's us considering ourselves. That's us saying, are we going to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt and say that we can be impactful somewhere else? Or do we say, I'm going to stay and fight because I know that I'm making space for myself, that I deserve to be here, and that I am a benefit to this organization or department? But then are we risking these health factors? Especially as Black women, we know that there are a lot of disparities within healthcare systems and opportunities. And so if we stay and fight, are we putting ourselves first? Or are we considering what's going to be best for the company, making sure that we're taking care of ourselves? If we stay and fight, are we staying and actually fighting, or are we staying in this idea of shut up and dribble? Are we going to sit here? Are we going to keep our heads down? Are we going to just stay in the lane and do what we assume is expected of us, or what is told that's expected of us? And that leads to suffering in silence. That means that we're going to keep our head down, and sometimes that's what we have to do in order to get to that next step, right? We consider, how long am I going to be a coordinator until I'm moved up to being a director? But does that mean we have to suffer in silence in order to be complacent and accepted? And this idea of the marginalization, are we still going to be limited to what others see of us, or what the categories and the boxes that we are placed in? Or are we going to move away from those and acknowledge those microaggressions and those changes?
And so as we think about this moving through anger and the discussion that needs to take place, where do we go from here? Like, where does the shift happen? So this is our call to action for you. Examine your systems. Really start taking a look around the room, around the table, on the screen. Who is there? Whose voice is missing? Really examine your systems that you kind of navigate. What can you do within your own sphere of influence? Consider how much space you're occupying. When you open your mouth in a room, consider whether or not you are quieting the voices around you. Are you taking over or speaking for other people around you? Reflect on your privilege. Our group talked a little bit about just reflecting on the white privilege that you may have. You need to step back. We all have some form of privilege, but when we think about the privilege that we hold in spaces, consider the others around you. Self-care. You have to take care of yourself. You have to figure out what you're willing to give. And that question, how much of myself am I willing to amputate? I asked that question probably over the summer, and that came from me, and really thinking about, like, how much am I willing to cut off to be here in this space? And to KaPreace's points on the other side is it worth it? You really have to think about it. Speak up. I am not wired to be silent. It just doesn't happen, right? I can recall being at a national conference and a national speaker saying something. I'm like, excuse me, do you realize what you said? Like, I'm not designed to do that. And I didn't raise KaPreace to do that. When I speak with young women and I do young women's workshops and things, I talk about being present in your presence. Anybody can show up, but when you show up, you need to speak up. And so you need to be able to have voice in that space. Assess your environment. We need to start really thinking about what's happening around us, because sometimes we operate in such silos and our plates are so full that we don't see what's happening around. So we need to step back and take some assessment of that. And then determine how much risk are you willing to take, right? Some of us are like, I'm passionate about this and I really want to do this, but then you have the option to check out, right? So I am like, and Kristen, close your ears, right? It's several times I'm like, I'm quitting. I don't want to work for the district anymore, right? And then I think, oh no, I have work to do, right? And there's really, I have to determine how much risk am I willing to take. So I've grown and matured, and there's just points where I'm like, I'm putting this out here and it's not to harm anyone, but it's part of my job. But we all have to really determine, like, how much risk are we willing to take? And that's where the shift occurs. Moving through the anger, which you have to acknowledge and accept. My anger is real. My frustration is real. The power of what my daughter is experiencing, us in these generational kind of formats of mirrored experiences, they're real. And one thing I've always told her is that all your feelings and what you're feeling is okay. Don't ever not feel what you're feeling. Don't ever question what you're feeling. But now, how do we move through this anger so that we can have true shifting and outcomes to occur? KaPreace, do you want to share anything on that?
I think it's just definitely important to make these intentional moments, to, after you leave here today, continue to have these conversations. Ask yourself these questions that we've been asking on a weekly, on a monthly, whatever the case may be, so that you can continue to do intentional work for yourself, for your organization, and then for your community as well.
Yeah, thank you. So if any of you are familiar with, and I know we gave a list of resources to Sarah that she's going to share with you, but also just want to share with you just this reference, this resource. Robin DiAngelo, she does some really great work around conversations of white fragility. I encourage you to read the book, and it made an important point in the article for The Guardian that they wrote, and it said that we have to get over the idea that, like, things around racism is a series of individual acts of intentional meanness. We have to think about the fact that white people, some, a lot, assume niceness is the answer to racial inequality, and it's not. It's not about just being kind and just being nice. That's part of it. It's not about just saying, I want to be a better person to this person. It's about reflecting on your power, your privilege, examining the spaces that you hold, looking at what you can do within your own sphere of influence, and stop getting out of the proverbial clutching of the pearls of just the me individual, but how can we impact and change our system?
I will try to keep it together as I thank you both. I found this to be very emotional and informative and inspirational. I know others did as well. So I just want to thank you guys from the bottom of our hearts at Influential Women. It's been a great pleasure learning from you today. Their contact information is up on the screen. If you want to follow up with both of them or either of them, we'll include that in a follow-up email as well. I want to thank all of you for being here today, participating and sharing your own experiences. I know this is a space that we all care deeply about and want to learn more from, and I appreciate you guys taking the time to do that today. Now I'll move into a little bit of the influential women stuff where I'll be a little less emotional, which is that as I mentioned earlier in the program, we will be kicking off the 2021 Influential Women of This Year Nevada Awards campaign with nominations in May. So I just want you all to stay tuned to learn more about that and to start thinking about who you might be nominating for those this year. And you can visit our website, which is weareinfluentialwomen.com to sign up to stay in touch with us or keep up to date with other things that we're doing. So that is all we have officially planned for today. We will keep, again, the line open here just for a little bit while longer in case people want to get contact information or have any follow-up questions. And again, thank you all for being here. Thank you, KaPreace and Tiffany. We wish you all a wonderful day.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was amazing.